Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a stage-trained podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 140, One and Only Olivier.
That's right. Today we're talking about the one and only Sir Laurence Olivier. Actually, I think he was elevated to the rank of Baron towards the end of his life. Like, he was granted a peerage.
But we'll call him Larry.
Yeah. Our old chap, Larry.
Larry boy.
But yeah, we're talking about him today. He is probably best known for being, well, one, a really good actor, but also two, being a very theatrical actor who was relatively prolific within the film space. But
he's the actor's actor of all time.
He always maintained that identity of being a stage actor. Which is fairly different from a lot of the other people who made very similar transitions over the course of the 20th century. And even up into modern times, I don't think even maybe one of the successors to the mantle, kind of like, or aspiring successors, I should say, like Branagh, he definitely has the aura of a theater actor, but maybe not to the same extent Olivier did. Olivier was always stage first, screen when he needed money. So
at least at the beginning.
Very much so, yeah. So we're going to talk about Laurence Olivier today, and I ask you to bear with me. We kind of covered a biography. We both read an audiobook biography of Olivier, and there is quite a bit to talk about when it comes to his career. His career does not have the nice standard trajectory of a lot of film actors we talk about, where they have an education.
Because he wasn't mostly a film actor,
Yeah, an aspiring role, and then a breakout role, and then different sections of their bodies of work after that. He has a very wibbly-wobbly career that's all over the place because he is mostly a stage person. And stage acting is hard to recount, one, because I'm not used to it, and two, because it doesn't have a nice archive of work seasonal. Like film does. It's very ephemeral and seasonal and weird. So I'm going to try to get through this as fast and as efficiently as possible, so bear with me. Laurence Olivier, born 1907 in Surrey, England, to Reverend Gerard and Agnes Olivier, and I believe one of his uncles was already a lord, but he did not currently have that title. Young Laurence received his first lessons in performance from watching his father preach, and also, even though the two were never close, the relationship with his father was always quite strained and distant. But he would put on performances at home for his mother and his siblings, and his mother was his first admirer, who unfortunately passed away at a relatively young age. And those two relationships kind of shape a lot of Lawrence's psyche and his need for that kind of like built-in actor's need that I think all actors have to a certain degree, where they kind of need attention and affirmation. And I think that's part of like every performer's.
He had that in buckets, it sounds like.
Yeah, he really did. But as a child, he was admitted to the All Saints Margaret Street School Choir in England, where he participated in productions like Julius Caesar, which earned him quite a bit of praise, including from a young actress known as Sybil Thorndike, who wrote in her journal, "The small boy who played Brutus is already a great actor." And Sybil Thorndike would be very important in his later career. He attended the Royal Central School of Speech Training and Dramatic Art. Wow, England really overnames their schools, but he did. He is classically trained at the Royal School himself, and after graduating, he did not get money from his father. He began the life of a young, hungry theater actor, picking up any work he can within the London stage acting world, signing on to companies, taking seasons where he could, and earning spots in bigger companies eventually with the help of Thorndike and Thorndike's husband. In 1930, with an impending marriage to his first wife, a marriage that would not work out, Olivier took on his first film work ever to make money in Berlin, shooting a movie, a couple movies, but the first one that came out was called Too Many Crooks, about a guy who's trying to break into his own safe at the same time that an actual thief is trying to break into the safe as well. And what he was doing was shooting the English version of a German movie. It was almost like the spaghetti westerns of a later era, where they would shoot the whole in multiple languages at the same time, with the intent of international release. And this is very early sound era, so it makes sense that studios are paying attention to that kind of thing. Olivier was cast in the Noel Coward play Private Lives, which began a very important friendship and mentorship in his career, or in his life. Coward would often kind of play that role of older mentor and occasionally be able to actually talk sense into Olivier when Olivier wasn't doing something logical. He spent some time in the early 1930s making more films at RKO on contract and partying it up in LA in the Hollywood of the 1930s with one Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Apparently, they were quite the young men about town.
Days.
Yeah, wild days. I think of those club scenes from The Aviator.
Yeah.
Where we actually see like the Coco Cabana, I believe the club was called, in full swing, like that kind of thing. In 1935, he played Romeo and Mercutio. Apparently, this is a very popular thing in some theatrical regards, where actors would essentially trade off roles between nights or between parts of the season. But he played both Romeo and Mercutio opposite John Gielgud in a John Gielgud production of the play, where he received criticism for not performing in the traditional style of Romeo. Apparently, there were very set ways in the early 20th century that you played all Shakespearean characters, and you weren't supposed to really deviate from that. And it sounds like Olivier was one of the first ones to kind of push open that box, along with some other actors in the same cohort, although he would certainly become the most famous.
Yeah, ironically, it seems that Olivier is credited for bringing much more like realism to Shakespearean acting, which is funny because today we look back at Olivier and he's still like the big dramatic, like over the top kind of actor, which we're going to see in some of his movies. But this certainly that is a toning down of the classical form of the acting in these types of plays.
Yeah, my understanding was it used to be very like grand prose or poetry, almost like a recitation style than a performance style. But yeah, Olivier seemed to have a very... It's weird because when you're, and this is something that I think you see in a lot of biographies, but when you're going through the biography by Donald Spado, which is the one we kind of covered in prep for this podcast, you see him as a younger man kind of introducing new methods into acting and pushing how you're doing things, and he gets to be an old codger. He's like, I don't understand these children and their method. What's the method? You just act.
That's gonna be fun when we get to Marathon Man.
Yes. But in 1936, he would join a very important establishment in his career, the Old Vic Theatre, which was in a less fashionable venue in London, where he would be able to hone his skills as a Shakespearean actor. He did a lot of Shakespearean roles at this theater, including Hamlet, Henry V, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, Macbeth, which I can say because we're not in a theater right now. During this time, he also met and fell in love with Vivien Leigh, the famous actress from Gone with the Wind. And those two had a very long romance while they were both still married to other people. And then they were married for a very long time. And then it ended very poorly.
It was such like petty high school drama, just listening through the story of that. It's ridiculous.
Boy, if you've ever seen the movie Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, yeah, that was the vibe I was getting, like that kind of like bitterness and vibes and stuff. It was nasty and petty. But anyway, he reached more critical success in Hollywood with Wuthering Heights and Rebecca, striking his acting style against the rougher and kind of totally opposed styles of directors like William Wyler and Alfred Hitchcock, which we'll talk about more in detail because we're covering those two movies specifically today. Olivier was also encouraged to stay in entertainment by the British government during World War II instead of enlisting, which he wanted to do, tried to do, kind of did, and then immediately gave up after it turns out he couldn't really fly a plane. And the British government was like, stop trying to fly a plane. Just go make a movie.
Not for lack of trying.
Yeah.
He wanted to fly real bad.
So he made the two probably biggest, most important movies he made during this time period were That Hamilton Woman, which is a very patriotic film covering the story of Admiral Nelson, who was the big British admiral during the Napoleonic Wars, who stopped Napoleon's fleet multiple times, and Henry V, which obviously we all know Henry V. Who doesn't know Henry V? Which again is a very patriotic.
We've already covered it, so come on.
Yeah, of course. I
Not
remember
that
the episode
one particularly. It was Brenna.
Yes. And Henry V, which was a huge, huge success. Henry V was probably the thing that actually launched Olivier into the fame that we know him as today. Yeah. It's when he became both a very famous film actor, because it was very popular in both England and America, mostly because it was promoted so heavily as a British propaganda film during the 1940 World War era, which makes sense. But two, it also cemented him as like the premier Shakespearean of the world at the time. Yeah. He was like the most famous person to ever play a big Shakespearean role on screen, kind of redefined the way you played it, and kind of made like big Shakespearean Technicolor extravaganzas seem marketable, which would be important for his later career when he would do movies like Richard III. He returned to direct. Oh, and before we forget to mention it, and we'll talk about it more, he actually ended up directing Henry V after the guy who was hired to direct it couldn't, and Laurence Olivier didn't want to give the role to anyone else, so he ended up directing it. He returned to direct more seasons at the Old Vic during and after the war, and even embarked on an international theater tour with his wife, Vivian Leigh. They had a very extensive stage career together that was mostly filled with them comparing their reviews. It was, again, very nasty. In 1950, Olivier took over running the St. James Theatre in England, staging plays with his wife like Caesar and Cleopatra and Antony and Cleopatra. And apparently they did some of those as like double headers. So they would perform like the whole play and then like the next whole play, which sounds intense. But again, a lot of their marriage was built around like promoting this idea of Lord and Lady Olivier. And, you know, they were the great acting couple and the great British pride couple and all that. So there's a lot of stress that comes along with it. And they had to do stuff like that to kind of keep the act up. His third film directing effort, Richard III, was a critical success, but this was the first of his Shakespearean efforts on film that was kind of not a big financial success. In fact, it was kind of a flop compared to the returns on some of the other big Technicolor productions he had done. And that kind of torpedoed his later planned adaptation of Macbeth to film, which I'm kind of bummed about because I would have loved to have seen that.
That would have been great. And although it does seem like Richard III was played later on television, kind of in the same way that It's a Wonderful Life just went through reruns and reruns and reruns until everyone fell in love with it. And the same thing happened with Richard III. And I even saw someone quote that said, Richard III, through its television reruns, did more to popularize the like Shakespearean film than anything else, because it like people loved it when they were watching it from home, basically. So it definitely like got there, but not in time to get Laurence Olivier the money he needed to keep doing it. Yeah.
And of course his that period where he was producing those large Shakespearean films was probably the period where Olivier was most interested in movies. And it kind of faded a little bit after that again. So as long as film offered him a venue to do more Shakespeare, he seemed very interested.
And make
Without
money.
it, he kind of just looked at it as a venue to make money. During the 50s, his professional and personal relationship with Leigh finally burned out and came to an end. He produced and starred in a movie, The Prince and the Showgirl, with Marilyn Monroe. Which was, again, not a great working relationship. He had a history of butting heads with his female co-stars.
Well, Marilyn Monroe had a history.
Monroe was never super easy to work with on set, and that's more than just like the standard label that gets placed on a lot of actors and actresses. Marilyn Monroe was somebody who was always under the thumb of somebody else. She was almost always like being I don't want to say controlled, sometimes controlled by whoever her current like acting coach was. There was like a series of them. So that person was always on set. It was a big problem. And Laurence Olivier being a snoot did not help matters. And then he both produced the play and starred in the film version of a story called The Entertainer, where he met his future wife, Joan Plowright, who played his daughter. in both the play and the movie, which doesn't come off great. There was an age difference.
We're
but
not
that
even
marriage,
touching his affairs, just his marriages.
Yeah, we're not counting those. There's a lot of those too. But his marriage with Plowright would last until he died.
Barely.
In the 60s, he ran the Chichester Festival, which I think is in Ireland, and helped create the National Theatre, which is in England. He would continue to play in films as well, but his focus was nearly always on his theatre craft during this point in time. He played his last Shakespearean role on stage in 1968 as Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, which was a fill-in role. The actor who was going to play Shylock couldn't, so he stepped in. In 1970, he was made a baron by Parliament for his theatrical services. He kind of tried to beg that off. He both equally loved and hated himself, and this was the latter half coming through where he was like, I haven't earned this. But Parliament kind of sat him down and was like, you're going to take this. And he was the first person to ever take the title of baron through national contributions made through the arts like theater. Directed his last play in 1974, Eden's End, then stepped down from his role as director at the National Theatre. In his last years, he would appear in film roles when he was strong enough, as he was chronically sick during this period, although typically no longer playing leads, and would even do TV occasionally, including his actual final role in a Shakespearean story in any medium, playing King Lear in a TV version of the adaptation in 1983, which won his 5th Emmy. Apparently, he played Lear a number of times throughout his career, and he did quite the good job of it almost every time.
Yeah,
and it's
an interesting one to end on.
Yes, it's kind of an appropriate career ender in a lot of ways. He passed at home in 1989, and his ashes now rest in the Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. And that is the life of Laurence Olivier, which is way more complicated than I just made it sound, which was already fairly complicated. But yeah, he bopped through a lot of different mediums, and he's a complicated guy. But we are talking about his movie work today because this is the Filmlings and not the Stagelings, although I hear Jonathan's thinking about starting that as a side project. But Jonathan, what film specifically are we talking about today from the great Sir Laurence Olivier? Baron Olivier.
Baron Lord Olivier. We are starting with Wuthering Heights from 1939, based on the book by Emily Bronte, although changed, starring Merle Oberon and David Niven, directed by William Wyler, and produced by Samuel Goldwyn. And we're mentioning producers in these first two because it has an important role in how the movie turned out.
This was back when producers mattered to a production.
They had some big hits.
Oops, was that a slam?
Probably.
I think that was a slam.
Following that up with Rebecca from 1940, based on the book by Daphne du Maurier, starring Joan Fontaine and directed by Alfred Hitchcock, produced by David O. Selznick, which
that was real important
controversy there. And then we're jumping a little bit to Richard III from 1955, based on the play by William Shakespeare, of course, directed and produced by Olivier, with a co-director, Alexander Korda, who was important because Olivier was also starring in the movie, so it's hard to direct and act at the exact same time. Starring Ralph Richardson, Claire Boom, Cedric Hardwicke, John Gielgud, Lawrence Naismith, and Norman Woodland. Dubbed the All-Sir cast by American critics because these were some well-known names and faces up there.
Yeah, they were all knighted actors of England, and American critics were kind of turned their nose up at that a little bit. They were like, oh, that's kind of snooty. And Olivier probably would have been like, yes, you're quite right. I'm British. I care about class.
Right. And finally, we are going towards the end of his career in Marathon Man from 1976, based on the book by William Goldman, adapted into a screenplay by William Goldman, also starring Dustin Hoffman, Roy Schneider, and Martha Keller, and directed by John Schlesinger.
Yes, him. But yes, without further ado, let's get into it, starting with Wuthering Heights from 1939, or at least the first half of it. Jason, take it away.
Wuthering Heights from 1939. Kathy Earnshaw is the daughter of country gentry in the West Yorkshire moors of England. Her father, a kind man, takes in a young street urchin named Heathcliff after a trip to the city. Heathcliff and Kathy are drawn together despite their class differences, but Kathy's brother, Hindley, despises the common boy, resenting the attention his father showed the stranger. Mr. Earnshaw dies young and leaves the three children to grow up into hateful and haunted adults, caught between forbidden love and grudges as bitter as the howling winds of the Yorkshire moors.
Honestly, I will say this movie kind of gave me a new appreciation for Wuthering Heights.
Wuthering Heights isn't bad. It's just the way it's taught in English class is bad.
Frankly, they screwed it up. Like the ending of the movie, and this is like, we're gonna get into Olivier in a second, but let's just talk about like the way that they adapted the story, because they ended it and basically made the movie mean the exact opposite of what the book is supposed to mean. Like the movie has this whole like true love wins, and like they have this afterlife joining together but like the whole point of the book is to show how toxic this relationship was, and this is not a good thing. This is not a love is triumphant kind of a story. And actually William Wyler was very upset that they changed the ending for that. And that's why I put Samuel Goldwyn on there, because Goldwyn was very happy with this movie. He was very proud of the changes at the end. And I think he came up with it late. And so at the very end, when you see the ghosts of Heathcliff and Kathy walking through the snow, they had to like use body doubles because the movie was over at that point. And
and no one would come back to do it.
Yeah, no one was there. But yeah, like the ending is like they finally got together at the end. It's like, but no, they were not supposed to. Like, this is not a good thing. Anyway, the movie is very, very dramatic, but it should have been a cautionary tale, and it turned into a like some kind of dramatic toxic love wins type of story.
Yeah, it's a very much a Hollywood ending at the very end, in that classic 1930s, I should say early 1940s kind of way, because 1940s is kind of when Hollywood actually starts to get dark. But during the 1930s, it was very glossy, and it's kind of like that kind of ending. I can understand. I mean, we did a whole episode on Wyler like 3 or 4 episodes ago, and he was not shy about getting into dark, gritty stuff for sure.
Yeah. But he's also a very literate person and understands like the point of the book, and that was not the point of the book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And speaking of, or at least focusing on Olivier's performance here, it is very strong. It is very big. It's one of the bigger performances that we're going to talk about today from Olivier, even just compared to the one that comes like a year later in Rebecca.
Very different.
And
although the characters are pretty similar, but the performance is very different.
Yes. And a lot of that is because Olivier is still learning how to act on camera. I mean, he had done acting roles beforehand, but it would not be amiss to say that this is probably the highest profile picture he'd been on up to this point.
Oh, for sure.
And probably the one with the biggest other talent in the room, after he had kind of started to become a bigger talent himself. And part of that kind of shows in Olivier has a tendency of this, and I think it's true in basically every film we're going to talk about today, except for the latter two, one where he's in charge and the other where he's an old man, where he would be very jealous of the focus and attention paid to specifically his the female lead.
Especially but even Richard III, like John, he had this whole thing with John Gielgud, where John Gielgud was like very admiring of Olivier, and Olivier just thought he was better than him and was always a little bitter about it. But we'll get to that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes from, again, the very hard transition of Olivier being like such a theater kid, and like a kind of a toxic theater kid, but such a theater kid from like his roots. Because, we talked about him getting accepted into like that Margaret Street School. That happened at 10. And even before that, he was doing plays on his own. So he was basically been like acting and enamored with the art of acting like constantly throughout his life. So he was so ingrained in that theater culture where there isn't the same kind of like favorage played towards actresses, at least not to the same extent as in Hollywood. Because in Hollywood, there's this whole thing about like, oh, you do the woman the favor. You do all of their shots first.
Yeah.
And then they can basically
they get the
leave.
glowy close-ups.
Yeah, and when the man acts, he has to act normally to a double in his close-up, or at least often, because the woman's off stage getting rest so that we don't wear out her face, basically.
Well, also the lights would literally burn your eyes out at that point. So
this is true. Yes, the giant lights of early Hollywood were
that literally shoot
strong.
UV like into your eyeballs.
Yeah, a little UV is good. That much UV is not good. But yeah, you can see, so you can kind of see some of that going along there. Of course, most of it is probably just Olivier's unique neuroses coming across, of which there are many.
I think we should point it out like pretty early on here, because one of the most interesting things about Olivier's career is that for the types of work that he did, both on stage and on screen, like the movies we're talking about are very literary. Like they're very, they have a history of, people thinking about these stories and talking about them and analyzing them. But Olivier was not a very like analytical guy. He's not the most highly educated. He had a good education, but he always also had this inferiority complex about anyone who was very cultured or anyone who was very intellectual about this type of thing. Like he had this.
Dude had a chip on his shoulder.
Yeah, but he had a really good intuition for these characters, and he was able to get into their minds, but he didn't have a literary taste or a literary mind, which is very interesting, but he knew it at the same time. And so anyone that he perceived as being more intelligent or more cultured, he would always have like a distance to them.
Yeah. One of the rare exceptions actually is Noel Coward, who was the one who actually like, I think there's a quote from Olivier saying he didn't read before Coward came along and was like, dude, you've got to read these books.
You got to just read books. Yeah. He gave him like Dickens, like the basics.
Yeah. One of them he recommended actually was the Bronte sisters in Wuthering Heights.
Yeah, that's right.
That was back in like the early 30s though. And this is the late 30s. But yeah, he was a petty dude. He was, some of those neuroses come across in like his skill to pick up some of this acting, and pick up these performances and develop like these characters who are bundles of complexities in their own. But yeah, it definitely made him also kind of hard to work with at times.
Yeah.
But speaking
that's an interesting point too, just to throw it out there real quick, is one of the things that he says about the way that he acts is he always finds a piece of himself in the character. And he always finds something like even the really challenging characters that he plays, like when we're going to talk about Richard III, he always finds something in there where he can understand their motivations. Like there's some darkness in himself that he sees in the character, or some contradiction within himself that he sees, and he's able to tap into that, not in like a method acting way, like we're going to talk about, but once he understands the motivations of the character, however flawed and different from himself as a rational human being he's able to kind of give life into that performance, because he knows internally where that performance, those actions, those lines are coming from.
Yeah. And he can take direction. That was never like a super big problem, but he did butt heads with William Wyler on
We just covered William Wyler, so if you remember,
and we did mention this.
He directed.
Yeah. Wyler is the kind of guy who would do 50 takes, and when you asked him what was wrong, he'd just like do it. He'd just say like, do it better.
Yeah.
And so
for a kid coming up and never having acted in movies before, it's a little unsettling.
And essentially Wyler was trying to get his actors to do something else, but he wouldn't communicate that directly.
He wanted
kind
them
of
to
like
figure
do
it
like a Kubrickian almost like mind game with them, to get them to do what he wanted. And what he wanted Olivier to do was to tone it the heck down.
Yeah.
You don't have to play to the back of the house anymore. The camera's right there. It can pick up a lot more than you ever could on a stage. I mean, just think about the power of a close-up, and all that can be conveyed through that you would never see in a theater.
This is a classic problem.
So this is big thing. I know there are classes out there actually just designed around helping like theater kids transition to acting in front of camera or learning how to do that. And I believe at some point in time you took that, didn't you, Jonathan?
Okay, yeah.
Because you have a theater kid background.
Anecdote time. Yeah, this doesn't actually come up very often on the podcast, surprisingly. But yeah, I was in theater for the theater growing up from elementary school through high school. And I was also interested in film acting. And obviously, I have a big interest in film. So I took a couple of audition. I like movies. I took a couple of audition classes for film, and in one of the audition workshops that I did, the instructor literally made me sit down in a chair and put my hands behind my back and do the entire monologue again without moving because I was too theatrical. And so this is a classic problem that theater people always have when they try to act for camera, because the camera picks up every little nuance, every facial expression, every gesture comes across much bigger. You're not, like you said, you're not trying to prove to the person in the very back row, what you're doing, getting your point across, yelling all of your lines at them. So, and there are places for that. Like we're going to see in Richard III, a classic example, but movies like Wuthering Heights and Rebecca are not the time and place for that. And it's interesting because like the other thing that we mentioned in the William Wyler episode is that actors were often very frustrated with Wyler's style, but no one was ever mad at Wyler himself. Later, Olivier would credit Wyler for teaching him how to act on camera. Basically, he figured out through Wyler's directing style of always do it again, do it again, do it again. It makes the actor think about what they're doing and what they could do differently. And once you've exhausted all the possibilities of what you can do, you can still find a new, different way to do it. And that eventually just internalizes what you're doing, makes you think about every action that you're doing and what is different and what's different from the last time. And that taught Laurence Olivier how to act for camera, act differently, act smaller, act more emotionally, like all these things that go into film acting. And so yeah, I love that about Wyler, is that he's so intense, but no one ever hates him for it.
No. A lot of people come out of Wyler's productions saying he's one of the best directors they have ever worked with. And I think it might almost, or at least that they gave their best performances while Wyler was directing. And I think it might actually be because Wyler took the time to basically turn his movies into like acting schools in a way that a lot of other people didn't, which is, and it's very interesting because Olivier didn't necessarily love working with Hitchcock either. But when we get to Rebecca, we'll see that the acting-directing relationship is very different and also really similar in its disconnection. But, Wyler challenged a lot of people while directing them, but also caused them to grow. And you can see that in the contrast in the performance in Wuthering Heights to Rebecca and some of his later work as well. And I would also say it would be hard to imagine that his work with Wyler and his other film work didn't in some way, shape, or form influence his later theater work as well. Although, who knows, because theater's ephemeral and we'll never see that. So,
yeah, I think probably his TV work later in his career is probably the closest you can get to that, because I think a lot of those later performances were just like stage plays that they recorded and put on TV. Yeah, I will say though that this one in particular is definitely, I think even compared to Richard III, is the most melodramatic of the ones that we've seen. Like it's still a big performance, as toned down as it is. It's still very, and it's also kind of a product of the time. Like that's how everyone was acting at that point. It's very, oh, Kathy, oh, I've missed you so much. And it's interesting that he does have this like super melodramatic interaction with Merle Oberon. And then when he's acting against like David Niven or some of the other guy characters, he's just like the most stoic ever, and is like this diametrically opposed thing. But that's what Wuthering Heights is. It's a melodrama.
Yeah, oh, very much so. And like the intense is sort of the word. I mean, even the setting's melodramatic, which is kind of the point. But yeah. I did like this version of Wuthering Heights. I liked it a lot until the end. Again, I feel like they could have done without the "and now they've found each other. Their spirits are finally joined." But overall, pretty good. Oh yeah. All right. Let's move on to Rebecca from 1940. Jason, take it away.
Take us to Mandalay.
Yes, to Mandalay.
Rebecca from 1940. Maxim de Winter is suicidal. That is, until he meets a young woman whom he marries as his second wife. The second Mrs. de Winter arrives at the family estate of Mandalay. There she keeps herself subjected to psychological strain as the old housekeeper sabotages and berates her for not being her deceased former mistress. What's more, her new husband, Maxim, is anxious, depressed, and most definitely hiding something.
They do a really good job, both in it seems in the text, I didn't read the book, but also in the movie with the writing of making Mandalay into like this mythic place before you even get there.
It's the same thing as Citizen Kane, right? They do the same thing with
Xanadu.
Xanadu, that's right, yeah.
Although you see Xanadu before it's like spoken about though, right? Like you see like
the
worn
first shot, yeah.
You see like worn down Xanadu though.
Yeah. But Mandalay is the same.
I
think you start with like a flyover of Mandalay, right?
Last
night I dreamt I went to Mandalay, and you kind of
Oh yeah, that's right. You like start
it.
off in the woods on like a misty, dreamy walk. I will say that's my like key to introducing either people or locations in writing, whether movies, films, books, whatever, is typically the best way to do it, especially if you want a lot of impact, is to basically to build it up, or maybe not even build it up, but to give other people reactions to it in other locations in the world. So if you're about to meet somebody, what does everyone else think about this person before a main character meets them? Or what does everyone else think about Mandalay before you go to Mandalay in the narrative? And that's kind of what we get here with everyone else being like, Mandalay, wow. And even that actually gets a bit of a payoff later on when you hear Maxim de Winter, Olivier's role, talk about how Rebecca came along and kind of made this place into a spectacle that everyone's obsessed with. And before that, it was an estate, but it wasn't as like mythic as it was. But Rebecca kind of had her way with it. And speaking of the novel, we should mention there's a couple changes to the story here before that occurred during the adaptation. The one that was derived from the code.
Kind of amazing that this movie got made at all, based on how
it really
dark
is.
The story is.
It really, really is.
Wait, okay, before we get into this real quick,
the 1940s turn.
Yeah, before we get into this, I was pulling up the trailers for our promo episode, and this is played off like, there are laughs in Rebecca, there's tears in Rebecca. I was like, this is not like a two-handed movie. This is just like dark and sad. This is not a comedy. Like, there is a little bit at the very beginning, but ultimately this is a really dark movie.
Oh, yeah. Old marketing is always really weird because it's almost always like false. And it's almost always done by like the marketing department that doesn't
completely separate.
Yeah, that maybe hasn't even watched the movie before they make the ads. So it's always very weird. Not unlike some of the trailer cutting that we see today. Oh,
you're about to watch the trailer for Justice League.
In my opinion, you should not be allowed to make a trailer with any shot, any frame that isn't in the final movie. But that is not how it works. And I know because I do trailer pulls at work occasionally, they pull just stuff they like from dailies. And so it might not be something that makes the final cut. And normally if it's like a full scene that's removed or a character, they'll get rid of it. But, oftentimes it just makes it feel disingenuous. It makes you feel like you watched a trailer for something else. I don't like it. Anyway, but yeah, so for the code for this movie, they had to get rid of the truth of what happened to Rebecca. So
spoilers, by the way. This is important.
Spoilers for this 80-year-old movie. So in the movie, Rebecca basically committed like a sort of a suicide, or essentially died from sickness.
Assisted suicide.
Yeah, died from advanced sickness. But in the book, Maxim killed her.
Yeah.
Kind of like, again, by being goaded into killing her by Rebecca, who was an infuriating and kind of evil woman in a lot of ways.
Definitely.
Who basically goaded him into killing her as a final act of petty vengeance of, I don't know, perceived slightness. Although it doesn't seem like Maxim really did anything to Rebecca besides give her a lot of money.
To deserve this, yeah.
Yeah, by marrying her. And then Rebecca just kind of like, I don't know, screwed off, slept with a bunch of people, and goaded him into killing her.
A lot of people.
Yeah. The other notable change that just kind of shifts the tone a little bit is Danvers is much younger in the movie than she was in the book.
That's the housekeeper, yeah.
Yeah. There's also like, there is a bit of kind of like this romantic overtone to, or undertone to Danvers' obsession with Rebecca.
Yeah.
That was played down, especially because it was kind of like a psychosis thing. And that's a very, like, the mix of like kind of like murderous and romantic feelings is a very Hitchcockian thing, which makes sense why it would appeal to Hitchcock. But obviously the code turned down or cut some of those things as well.
There's a lot of just implicit stuff. Like there's so much of the story is like stuff that wouldn't get past the code. And so there's a lot of implication that's not really explicit, but it's also really hard to escape. And I think it's more explicit in the book, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, almost certainly.
But there's just a lot of stuff that's alluded to in the movie that you can basically just extrude into a much darker book, which is surprising because there's a lot of stuff that's alluded to in the movie.
The other big noticeable change that we should talk about, and this isn't from the book, this is just about the butting of heads of Selznick and Hitchcock. By the way, Selznick is probably one of the big reasons why this movie, as dark as it was able to be made, because he was riding high off of Gone with the Wind, which wasn't just like the biggest movie of 1939, but probably, but also like a 3-year press extravaganza. He milked that thing like a political campaign. Until he was like the most famous producer in Hollywood. He could get away with next to anything. And this movie, Rebecca, is actually kind of tied into the ongoing affair between Olivier and Leigh. Leigh was had been in production for Gone with the Wind for ages. And essentially Olivier, because they're basically having like a pseudo secret affair at this point. Olivier kept visiting her not very secret. That was the problem. He kept visiting her at her house, and Selznick was like posting guards to keep him away.
Yeah,
but they let him in anyway.
Having trysts on set, like, come on, guys, calm down.
Yeah, no, it's all very dramatic. It's very much like egos run rampant. But essentially, after. There were projects thrown Olivier's way to kind of keep him out of Leigh's orbit as much as possible, and this was kind of attached to that. And definitely, like, Leigh being Selznick's like star actress and Olivier being close to Leigh helped him get this role as well. But also, this was the first, as a lot of people know, and you'll study this if you cover this movie in film class. This is a popular one in film classes. This is Hitchcock's first American movie. where he came over from London, and he's still kind of developing into the sound era. And this is kind of like on the verge of making some of his most famous movies of all time during the 40s and 50s. The biggest one that came before this is probably 39 Steps. But this is also when Hitchcock is really, especially in the American system with how pushy producers could be, like especially Selznick, learning how to avoid them meddling by doing like essentially John Ford-esque stuff by editing in camera. And Hitchcock was always the kind of guy to plan stuff out to the nth degree and only shoot like exactly what he needed. But it got even more precise during this period, which is a very big turn for Olivier compared to the directorial style of Wyler, who was like Mr. 50 takes.
Because when you're on set with Hitchcock, when you're on set with Hitchcock, the movie is over. The actors just have to stand in the right spot and say the right things. Hitchcock is not going to try and get the perfect thing. He knows what he's doing, and it's mostly about making sure that the camera is saying the right thing and not the actor. Like, probably the best example is the climax when Maxim is doing his monologue about Rebecca.
Oh, and the camera just wanders across the camera like, the shows empty rooms.
Like this, it's almost a ghost of Rebecca. Like you're just imagining her as he's telling the story. It's just this one long shot of Maxim. Probably the best scene for Olivier too, because he's narrating. The whole point of the movie is you never see Rebecca. It's just her presence is haunting the dialogue of the other characters, her influence on the location and the set, her influence on Maxim and his psychology. And in this scene, Maxim is describing the worst moment with Rebecca where she dies at, sort of his hand, and depending on the movie or the book, but he's just painting a picture for the audience in our mind, and the camera is floating through the room, and you're putting the pieces together in your mind, which I thought was really interesting. Like, I've seen this before, but this made me realize that a lesser director would have just done a really dramatic flashback. And Hitchcock is too pro to do that. He's like, I'm just going to show you an empty room.
Rebecca has to stay mythical too. We never see Rebecca, and that's important that we never see Rebecca. One of my most favorite stories about the production of this movie, though, it comes down to that tension between Selznick and Hitchcock. Selznick's big idea, you might have heard this one before, Jonathan. Selznick's big idea for the ending is that not only that when the mansion catches on fire, that the fire turns into a giant R.
So cheesy.
It would have been super cheesy, and Hitchcock essentially did not shoot it and then kind of like snuck around to make sure it didn't happen. Because, could you imagine?
And the way he ended up doing it, where instead you see the embroidered pillowcase with the R on it and the negligee, and
it's like the so burning much up more, of the ghost.
Yeah. First of all, it's realistic. Second of all, it's more thematic too, because like the negligee is a huge part of the whole thing, and of the psychological torment of the new Mrs. De Winter, which I don't think she even has a first name in the story. I think she's literally just Mrs.
She is
De
a nameless
Winter.
character, and that is another point too. She is just Mrs. De Winter.
Yeah, but it is interesting to see a lot of Hitchcock's trademarks kind of in a really early stage here, because we talked so much about Hitchcock. We did an entire series on him, and we never got to this one. But there's a lot of those trademarks that are coming into being, and like you said, the themes of the film are very Hitchcockian. Honestly, if we saw Rebecca, I bet she would have the opposite hair color of Joan Fontaine in the film, because that's how Hitchcock likes to do it. But instead, she's a ghost.
Yep. No, good ghost story. Without being a ghost story. Yeah. Again, emergence of genre into the mainstream, powerful independent producers in Selznick, turning into more the acceptability of dark themes just brought about by, a dark time in world history with World War II. It's an important movie. You can see why it ends up in a lot of film school curriculums. Yeah. You can also see like the difference in Olivier's performance between Wuthering Heights and Rebecca.
This one is so subdued.
Yeah, this one's way more subtle. It's way more looky. And a lot of that is the way Hitchcock builds his scenes for close-ups and such. and Kuleshovs all over the place. But it is very it's much more effective for the film canister than Wuthering Heights. And of course, part of the Wuthering Heights like acting being so big is that it's Heathcliff, and Heathcliff is this huge like explosive toxic character. And Maxim de Winter is not that. But you can also, I feel like a lot of that is just, Olivier getting more used to the medium of film. He did films for most of the 30s, right? But he didn't do films where the directors were like actively trying to make something more than a off the line picture. He didn't do A pictures until now.
And I will say another thing that goes into his character in this one, and it's also tied to something that's very Hitchcockian that I think we talked about in the Hitchcock episode, is there's a huge portion of the story rests on the control and release of information, which is part of what makes any suspense good, which is why it's a hallmark of Hitchcock, because he was the best at suspense. But part of the mystery is Maxim's relationship with Rebecca. And so part of Olivier's job here is to keep us guessing of what his memories and feelings for Rebecca are before the moment when he says, "You think I loved Rebecca? I hated Rebecca." And then we're like mind blown because everyone else in the story loves or loved or had some weird love affair with Rebecca. And so they all have this reverence for her. And you assume that that's the same thing that Maxim is feeling. But you end up realizing that it's the opposite. And so then it casts his whole prior performance in a completely different light. Every time he blows up at the new Mrs. De Winter for doing something similar to Rebecca, you think it's because he revered Rebecca so much that he can't imagine another woman stepping into her shoes. But instead, it's because he is so scarred by Rebecca that he does not want his new wife to be anything like Rebecca. But that's part of Olivier's performance, is having this performance that at once feels two different ways. And when you're looking at it the first time, it feels one way. And then after you know the twist, you look back on it and you can see it in a completely different light. And he pulls it off really well.
Oh, yeah.
Although the one plot thing, like, why would he go back to Manderley? Like, he asks himself that, but I'm also just like, really, why go back? Just forget about it. Anyway, then there would be no story, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, there has to be a story. If he had chosen to just leave, there would be no book or movie. But alas, let us move on to Richard III from 1955. Jason, take it away.
Richard III from 1955. It would seem that the Wars of the Roses have come to a close, and a son of York sits the throne. Edward V wears the crown, has strong alliances, and 2 strong sons to carry his lineage. It's just a shame that he doesn't have the loyalist of brothers. His youngest sibling, the new Duke of Gloucester, Richard, craves the diadem, and there is no dastardly deed too low for him to stoop to. Betrayal, manipulation, murder, seduction. Richard will tear apart his family and his own mind in his quest to be King of England.
All right, Jonathan. So I had a brain blast finally while watching Richard III. I had an epiphany.
Okay.
Do you remember the movie Shrek?
Dude, I was going to say the same thing.
Richard III, Farquaad is Richard III. I did not realize that until like just finally watching this.
I tried to find someone who says it online, but it has to be. There's no other explanation.
And I'm willing to, the Richard III in this movie, like his appearance is very much based on some famous paintings of the actual Richard III. Of course,
and now
kind
it's
of
just,
eviled up.
it's the epitome of the character. Like, this is basically the
definitive edition.
Definitive,
Richard III. And you know, like when you were talking earlier about this one becoming like a very kind of like cult-loved movie via TV airings over decades and decades during the 60s and 70s, I was like, yeah, that's when the people who made Shrek would have been kids.
Exactly.
And you know what the weird thing is? Whenever I was looking up like War of the Roses Wikipedia, which I'm on the War of the Roses Wikipedia a strange amount of times, mostly when I was doing the read through of Shakespeare, and I was just like, okay, who's this again? And like looking up all
I
of
gave
the
up on that.
War of the
There's too
Roses
many.
characters. There are half of like the pages of plays that Shakespeare wrote are War of the Roses stuff. It
Yeah.
is wild. But the Richard III like official portrait that exists that you see on the Wikipedia page, it always looks so familiar to me. I was like, why do I know this? And I recognized it when I saw Richard III, Olivier's Richard III with his big prosthetic nose and stuff, because Olivier loved prosthetics. He loved hiding in his roles. His roles were always made up of like these external like habits and jumps and whittling of fingers and long noses. But when I saw him here, I was like, oh, it's Farquaad.
Yeah,
it's gotta be
it is
Farquaad.
exactly Farquaad. And it's
Okay,
I mean,
I'm glad I'm not the only
it's
one who
got all
thought
the
that.
things. Yeah, no, definitely. But the interesting thing I will say is that what Olivier was basing this role on is one of his past theater directors, Jed Harris, who was notorious for being just a tyrannical director. Everyone who talked about him
that's
hated
right.
him. He would just yell at people and make them cry and just be so mean to people when they were acting on stage.
Yeah, he was a big like emotional manipulator too, and yeah.
But it's interesting. So Laurence Olivier directly bases his performance on this guy, Jed Harris, and his look too, with like the crooked nose. Like he had a very stern face. If you look up pictures of Jed Harris, but also apparently Disney based a character of the big bad wolf on Jed Harris also. So like this guy made some enemies and has been immortalized in some classic characters for it, which is hilarious. Don't make enemies of artists.
Yeah. But yes, no, this performance is amazing. Like the other two, the previous two we talked about were really interesting just because of like seeing the development on screen. They're solid movies. Rebecca is probably an amazing movie. But this one is really recognizable for the quality of Olivier's performance. And of course, this is coming off of like a bevy of three Shakespearean movies in a row over a period of a decade and a half: Henry V, Hamlet, and Richard III.
Which the first two are also really, really good in their own right, but they're all very different, like in tone and style. Like Henry V is like this, like it starts off as basically a performance that Shakespeare would be giving of Henry V in the Globe Theater, which is really interesting, and then slowly kind of transitions into a film version, which is, I really love that technique. And then Hamlet is done in black and white, and it's so moody, which is perfect for the story itself. And then apparently Olivier had a tiff with Technicolor over Hamlet, which is how that ended up.
Olivier got into a fight with somebody.
Yeah, right. Which is how
What?
that movie got turned into black and white, which ended up being perfect. But somehow he worked it out. And so this is done in Technicolor, in VistaVision, instead of someone had encouraged him to do it in full on like 70 millimeter. And he was like, that's too much, but we'll do VistaVision. And I think to date, it's still the only Shakespearean adaptation done in VistaVision. And it looks great. It's so interesting. As dark of a story as it is, it's so colorful and bright in its cinematography, but it's gorgeous.
Yeah, it really is. It's impressive. I like the aesthetic where it feels like a stage play. And we
it's not
kinda
directly, but it
slowly-
still has that look to it.
It feels like you're already immersed within the world of the theater curtain has fallen away, and you just see
Right.
the play now. But I do really, really, really like that. I like how it works for it. It's really interesting too when you talk about like the production of these movies, because I'm sure you read about this too in about the biography by Donald Spotto of Olivier, where multiple times Olivier was in charge of like a season or a smaller theater, and would put the production in the hole from the get-go by overproducing the stage. Where he would like over design it and the sets were too big, and then like they would be in the hole because they had spent too much on the production, and then two, like I think there were one or two times where stuff just didn't work on opening night because it was overly complicated. I think that happened with Antony and Cleopatra, and I think it happened once in the Chichester Festival that I recall directly from the book. But it kind of makes sense that when he was given a large-scale production like Henry V or Richard III, and essentially was making, in a way, kind of like English propaganda of like aggrandizing a great piece of English culture.
But this one is much less propaganda than Henry V. This is not a rousing movie.
No, this isn't like England's great until the very end.
This is why America didn't do monarchy.
Yeah, this would be where we were like, no, we good. We'll keep our horses, thank you very much. But yeah, no, this one, when he has all this production for a movie-sized budget, his creativity with those large-scale resources becomes quite evident. And I actually find it even more fascinating that his dream set with these huge budgets isn't an immersive set. It's a set that just feels like his dream theater set.
It feels like a theater set, yeah.
Yeah, it feels like, oh, you're going to get all this money to make a movie set. Oh, so I can finally make the theater set I want? No, you're making a movie set. I'm going to make the theater set I always wanted.
Make sure there's an enormous crown above it as a symbol, even though film does symbolism very differently. Just make it, like really we do on stage.
Or like the way you paint a stage flat is such a signature way of painting that I don't know. It just really sticks out to me. Or like the way the one, all of his scenes are very fluid and mobile, but there's the one scene where he's pretending to be super religious, and his minions have like stoked the masses to beg him to take up the kingship.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, I can't do that.
I'm too busy praying.
I'm too busy praying. That's not how he sounds, but you know what I mean. But he's that whole set design where he's up on like this arcaded hallway on a raised platform above everyone else, and there's the big pit down below with all the little minions. It's very theatrical.
He just thinks in stage.
He thinks in stage. That's how his brain works, is in stage and in drama. And it actually, maybe if he could get his brain to stop thinking in a theater setting for a hot second, his personal life might not be in a shambles. But, he was definitely, his one and only love was definitely his performances, his career on stage. So
he said that multiple times. The only time I like myself is when I'm someone else on stage. Which is
actually
sad,
kind of explains why he's so keen to disappear behind all that makeup.
Oh yeah,
like I think he
said
really
that intentionally too.
Yeah,
there's a clip of him that's actually like everywhere. There's little snippets of it, but he did like an hour-long show on the Dick Cavett show, old talk show. He sits there for like an hour talking, but Dick Cavett at some point is like, now I have to ask, is this your real nose? Because in every performance you have a fake nose on. And he's like, yeah, no, this is my real nose today.
Man,
no one knows what your nose looks like.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows the nose. And, Olivier certainly isn't unique in having those neuroses. He's a special combination of those neuroses combined with
exceptional talent.
A big dose of talent, a big dose of like young exposure, which is always kind of important. Like he happened to fall into like a life path like very early on that just meshed well with his particular set of neuroses that led him to kind of have the opportunity to explore it in such a way. And I honestly, I don't know, this might be, a bit of a controversial take, but I genuinely don't think you get the kind of obsessive work or as obsessive focus on a career or a skill or a talent that Olivier has over such a long period of time, unless that's like the only thing going super well in a person's life. Yeah. And I think that might be, he just never really had a lot of success in his personal life. He had 3 marriages. None of them were particularly fantastic. And he kind of like the one thing he kept coming back to was his career and his acting and the place he felt happy. So this kind of became his happy space. So it kind of makes sense that he pours all this effort into it, and that it becomes like even bigger and grander for it. And of course, when people start calling you after Henry V, when people start calling you the greatest English actor, which was his stated goal from his early 20s, they wanted to become the greatest actor.
Or literally saying, you are England, that goes to your head.
Yeah. No wonder the dude has a huge ego. Not surprising. But yeah, it definitely makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I quite like this one. This one's a very fun one. I quite like Richard III as a play.
It's the quintessential love to hate him character.
It's so different than a lot of the other like historical plays. Like Henry V is like the best example of a goody-goody. And then even though Henry V obviously wasn't a goody-goody, but he definitely is held up that way. And a lot of the people in Shakespearean plays, in those historical plays, tend to get that treatment. Except for Richard III. They represent something else.
But even Richard III does, but it's just not the good parts of England.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the things that make Richard III so interesting and so unique among the canon. And its relative brevity compared to a lot of the other surrounding historical plays is always nice.
That's actually not the case. Richard III is the second longest behind Hamlet. Yeah.
It didn't feel that way.
But it
doesn't feel that way at all.
Because it's the really interesting ones fly by. Like Henry V is really long too, but it flies by because it's so fun to read. So it's just one of those ones that you enjoy. And even this movie is 2 hours, 41 minutes, which is really long for 1955. But I do want to talk about like one of the defining features of this story in particular, and especially the fact that it is Richard III where he employs this, but it's the breaking of the fourth wall, which is done right off the bat. And, Olivier,
we're colluding with Richard for the whole movie.
Richard is looking right at the camera during his soliloquies, which is it's a very theatrical thing, right? For the soliloquies, especially in Shakespeare, which is basically a dead art at this point, but Shakespeare's soliloquies are often played to the audience, which feels different on stage than it does on camera. On camera, like we were talking about, there's a difference in the way that acting feels. And when you are being spoken to on camera, it feels much more intimate. And especially for a character like this, who has no laudable qualities.
With Richard III.
Yeah, you feel like a conspirator. Like you're basically Richard's best friend in this, because everyone else,
best imaginary friend.
Everyone else who is close to Richard gets killed by Richard because he's such a terrible dude. But the audience is just in it, and the audience is part of all the bad things. It's almost a Hitchcockian technique, because Hitchcock always has a way of putting you on the bad guy's side somehow.
And at least into their psyche.
Yeah, and that's done right off the bat with Richard III, and he just looks at you, and he's got, just the whole character design, everything about him feels sleazy, and when he's talking to you, you just feel like you want to get away from him, but you can't because you're stuck watching the movie, and it's so good.
Gaslighty, and sometimes just downright, like, actually evil. Like the moment where one of his like nephews like says something a little too out of line, and he just gets scary all of a sudden.
He says, you should carry me on your shoulder. And that touches a nerve, and he death glares at him, which is so sad because that kid is so cute.
Everyone in the room he's about to die. So,
I know.
Spoilers, but everyone in that room gets terrified. Yeah, it is quite the impressive performance, and quite the impressive staging for the performance, coming from someone who would eventually become one of the most prolific and successful theater directors of English history. Because I don't know if I've ever heard about anyone doing as much theater directing as I've heard Olivier doing. It's quite substantial.
Yeah, he was all over the map.
All right, Jonathan, do you want to move on to Marathon Man from 1976?
Yeah, after we mention that, because this is something it hasn't applied to the first two stories so much, but definitely an aspect of Olivier's acting on stage and on screen is his physicality. And Richard III in general is just a really great example of that, because the character is crippled in his arm, his leg. Like I said, he's a hunchback. So there's a lot of characterization to be done there. But also, Olivier is always doing his own stunts, which the best actors do. But in this case, during one of the battle scenes towards the end, his horse bucked during the filming, and he literally took an arrow in his leg. And but ironically, it's the leg he was supposed to be limping on, so they just like kept going. But Olivier would do this all the time. He would fence too hard when he's doing duels, when he's acting in Hamlet, and like hurt himself and his fellow actors. The one thing is, he would never ask his actors to do something he wouldn't do himself. It's just he would push himself a little too hard. So that's the fun tidbit from Richard III. He literally took an arrow to the knee.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you bring up the knees, and I'm sure you heard about it going through the biography, but Olivier just messed up his knees.
You doing jump all this too stuff. Much. Stop jumping.
He jumped all the time. Like almost every play.
He reminded me of myself, honestly, so I can't criticize him too much.
You did do that, actually. I remember that now in high school. You would climb on everything. It was weird. Everyone would be like, "Where's Jonathan?" And be like, "Oh, he's up a tree again. Oh man, there he is. Look at him." And then he'd jump out of it, and we'd hear his knees crack.
Never broke anything, surprisingly.
Yeah. I remember the one performance, not your performance, but Olivier's, that was mentioned in the book, where he would do a thing where he would, in Titus Andronicus, where he like fell off a platform, and he would be like caught by a rope that was tied to his feet or something. And so he would die hanging upside down, and eventually that like tore the cartilage in his knee. And I was just like, oh,
yeah. And there was an earlier one where he jumps over a railing and onto a staircase, and just missed it one time. Ooh, and of course, when you're doing that kind of stunt on film, it's one thing because you just get the right take. But when it's part of your stage performance, which this one was, you're doing that upwards of 50 to 100 times, depending on how long the show is running. You're not going to make that jump every single night. It's nuts.
Yeah, it is. That's a lot to put a body through. And he definitely, like, I mean, we're talking about his ego and stuff, but it's definitely that mix of like self-love mixed with self-hate. And he kind of enjoyed putting himself through hardship. In a certain amount, he had like an attitude mentioned multiple times directly from him in the biography, where he would talk about how like it's only what he deserved, or like he doesn't deserve anything better or something like that. It's quite the complex.
It's a tragedy in its own right.
Psyche. But yes, let's talk about another thrilling tragedy mixed with evil, Marathon Man from 1976. Jason, take it away.
Marathon Man from 1976. Thomas Babe Levy is a PhD history student in New York, researching to redeem the legacy of his father, a man who committed suicide after being investigated by the McCarthy Commission. Babe's big brother, Doc, poses as an oil executive. In reality, he's a government agent, milking a former Nazi war criminal for information on other Nazis hiding throughout the world. But when things go awry with Der Weisse Engel, Babe finds himself thrown into a dangerous and painful world.
Oh man, where do we even start with Marathon Man?
Well, we should mention that this is just like a new stage of Olivier's career.
It's so different. I mean, this is getting into different. American New Wave, which we've talked about, yes. But it's a totally different way of making movies and telling stories. And this like has all the elements of American New Wave. It has really gritty storytelling, although it was cleaned up a little bit, which we'll talk about. It has method acting from Dustin Hoffman. It has, this is a fun fact, the first feature film to feature the Steadicam, because the creator of the Steadicam was working on the film, and so all the shots of Dustin Hoffman running and the camera is following him is a guy literally running next to him with a big weighted camera, it's a classic technique now, and now it's much more digitized, but it became a staple of filmmaking, but it was a new thing at the time. So this is filmmaking is getting lighter and more mobile. This is acting is getting more sketchy, shall we say. This is storytelling becoming grittier, and this is also looking back on World War II, which in 76 is still, I mean, we talked so much about World War II films.
It's still fairly recent in 76. I mean,
and we talked about like films looking back on World War II were happening like while World War II was happening. But, you know, this is definitely World War II is in the past, and but it's still haunting the present. There's a lot that can be kind of read into Marathon Man. It's very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. This is also definitely the period of time where Olivier is like, oh, these kids and their method. Although he was maybe more mad about that during the 60s than during the 70s. During this period of his career was the period where he was regularly chronically ill.
In a really interesting way that I had never heard of before. Like his skin was constantly in pain from any kind of contact. Which
I had that for a day after my second COVID shot, and it was not fun.
Imagine living with it.
Yeah, I could not imagine living with it. So essentially, Olivier would kind of like shoot films in between extreme bouts of sickness, or more strenuous bouts of sickness, I should say.
Yeah.
And when he was feeling healthy, he would do films mostly kind of, well, one, he did like acting, and even though he didn't have the stamina for a full stage season or production, he was able to do film work, which is less, you're maybe talking about, 2 to 3 months of shooting for a film versus 2 to 3 months of prep for a 3-month run of a play or something like that.
Yeah.
So, it's more viable. He also kind of needed the money later in life. But this is definitely a time where he took on different roles, less active roles, no jumping for him. And he would play antagonists and more minor characters. So this is definitely a different situation for him. But there was a lot of meat to chew on in these roles as well. And in Marathon Man, he's playing a very evil character. And as we just saw in Richard III, he's very good at that. And so it's very interesting to see him play this, especially seeing him play a Nazi when I've also watched in prep for this episode, Boys from Brazil, where he plays a Nazi hunter. So it's a very interesting flip-flop there. And
yeah, as a Nazi, he didn't
as a
have
Nazi?
like...
How do you want to phrase that sentence, Jonathan?
Well, I'm just saying, as a Nazi, I thought it was interesting that he didn't really do like the big German accent. And I don't know, I know there were like certain accents that he didn't do as well as others. But this one and I think this one is supposed to be like a very well educated, very like language literate kind of character. So it works. But also he's kind of a classic version of the just so evil kind of a character. Like who comes up with torture of just drilling into people's teeth? It's so dark.
I think that's just a real thing.
Well, yeah, and it's definitely based on like actual. I mean, this is not literally based on real events, but definitely taken from. Not that there's like any shortage of the evils to pull was a real from.
Person, yeah,
yeah,
or the white angel.
I don't know about just using dental torture as like a preferred method of obtaining information. Maybe it happened. I would not be surprised.
I mean, dental pain is classified as like the most extreme pain one can feel.
Yeah, but it's not the most filmable, and that's actually filmable. That's part of the. I think is really interesting because this is at the very beginning of the American New Wave, and but when they screened this, it was too violent for audiences, so they cut a lot of stuff. They cut apparently some extreme close-ups of the dental torture of actually seeing a tooth be drilled into. They cut the part where Roy Scheider gets stabbed. Apparently there was much more graphic like disemboweling in that scene that was not filmed.
Nothing like a more extreme disemboweling.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff that was cleaned up, which I think is so interesting because a couple years later, we're going to get into stuff like Scarface that we just talked about recently, where they're just going to cut off people's arms with chainsaws. And, we're showing everything at that point. But this is on its way there. But still, even Marathon Man could not get to the full level of complete torture.
Nah, yeah. And this is still pushing it for the time.
Oh, for
and
sure.
A lot of this movie is mostly about like the almost just psychic torment that Dustin Hoffman's character experiences over the course of the movie.
It
where
almost
he's not
plays off
sure,
like a nightmare at points.
Yeah, like where he's hiding in the room, or people appear in the dark,
or he
he's
just
not
has
sure
to
they're
run
there.
through the city in the dark in his pajamas. People are betraying him left and right.
Yeah, I will say it is really satisfying though, when his neighbors are like, "Yeah, we might not like you, but you're our neighbor."
Yeah,
they help him out.
That was a great scene.
Yeah, and then of course the end scene is rather satisfying actually.
That was changed, which is really interesting. Apparently, Goldman had rewritten the script like 3 or 4 times in order to get it to a filmable version, and they had I forget who it was. Someone came in and helped with the rewriting, and apparently the ending in the book was Babe, Dustin Hoffman's character, takes Zell out to Central Park and just shoots him a bunch of times while monologuing, and but there's a lot more like thematic relevance to this one, and I'm not sure exactly.
I like this one better than
in the
that.
book, but yeah, it's not too over the top, but it's just smart enough that you're like, that's appropriate.
Yeah, it's quite good. I mean, it's the angel's greed destroying himself.
Mm-hmm. But it's a poetic justice, because you hear the stories of the Jews who had to literally swallow their belongings in order to not lose them when they're taken to the concentration camps. And so Babe, being a student of history, is like, you can keep as many of these diamonds as you can swallow. And yeah, it's dark, but it's poetic justice. That scene, the really underplayed scene, and again, this is the best scene for Olivier in the film, is him when he finally gets to New York and he gets to the financial district, and he's going through the diamond shops, and he's trying to find out the value of diamonds before he gets the diamonds.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees all these Jewish people living out their lives and, counting their money and all this stuff. And he's encountering people who have the concentration camp tattoos on their arms, and he's trying to play himself off until he literally gets recognized. But it's just such a slow burn of a scene, and so psychological, not for Dustin Hoffman's character at this point, but now it's like psychological torture for Zell. And it's so underplayed, but it's so good.
Yeah, no, it is definitely a different kind of filmmaking. It's becoming more and more subtle and actually it's really interesting because you can see the shift from 1939 and Wuthering Heights all the way to Marathon Man nearly 40 years later. Of film coming into its own, becoming less and less of a filmed play and becoming more and more of a subtler genre. Of course,
right.
Other rhetoric is developing, but the acting style becomes more subtle as you realize you need less and less on camera to convey emotion. And you can see that through the different waves of acting ideas and the method and stuff that have come along since then. And you can just see, it's kind of like an interesting benchmark to see somebody who was doing like essentially bonus work in the 1930s and early sound movies, coming all the way to 1976 and even 1980s with Boys from Brazil, to see, just the shift in just one man's career of the style.
Yeah, but at the same time, you're seeing him play against Dustin Hoffman, who's coming up through new acting schools, completely different from classically trained Shakespearean actors like Olivier. And there's a famous anecdote that we've already alluded to, where Dustin Hoffman had deprived himself of sleep for several days so that when he gets to the torture scenes, he's like really out of his mind. But apparently that also inhibits your ability to work in any kind of rational manner, even as an actor. And so after doing several takes of Dustin Hoffman like trying to do the scene while completely sleep deprived, Laurence Olivier just shouts, "Oh my goodness, why doesn't the boy just try acting?" Which is a very Olivier line. It's actually a cleaner line than usual. But it illustrates the difference in acting styles, because Olivier was not one of these people who's just like, I have to be the character. I have to be in the physical
there,
state,
though, which is the interesting thing, because he's always about finding something of himself, in putting something of himself into the character and stuff.
Right.
So he's partway there, especially compared to the older generation that was like, "Oh, you must play Shakespeare this way."
But he's also the kind of guy who people would tell stories of, especially later in his career, where he would be able to sit in a chair backstage and take a nap because he always overscheduled himself. And then in 2 minutes get up and do his scene, because he knew his work and he knew how to do the role and get into that mind frame, but he didn't have to physically wear himself out and get into this mind space and like take an hour to just get into the head of the character. He just knew it instinctually, and it was a thing that he could, turn on and turn off like a professional.
Yeah. It seems like he used some stuff that you might call method to arrive at a performance, but he didn't do the spontaneity of a lot of method actors where nothing was set.
Yeah.
He would create a performance using his own methods and then stick to that performance.
Yeah. Which is something you have to do as a stage actor, is basically bake a performance into, turn it into muscle memory. It's not an improvised art.
Yeah. No, you got to be able to do that easily every night. Same thing.
Yep. And he was very good at it.
All right, Jonathan, shall we slide into overall notes?
Let's do it.
Notes of an overall nature. And here we are. All right, Jonathan. So when we talk about Olivier, it's inseparable from the idea of Shakespeare. It's kind of just like,
oh yeah.
I mean, he's the Shakespearean. He's like,
we mentioned Branagh before, and after seeing, and especially watching Henry V, because I'm pretty familiar with Branagh's Henry V. I've seen it several times, and you can see so much influence from Olivier in Branagh's performance. He's almost just doing Olivier in the movie, and there are divergences, and obviously the filming technique and stuff like that has evolved a lot, but there's no denying the influence that Olivier has had on the craft of anyone doing Shakespeare after him. Yeah.
No, it's I wouldn't say night and day, but it definitely there's a difference.
Yeah, not that it's bad, but it's he has changed the game, basically.
Yeah, he's one of the defining one of the most defining Shakespearean actors of the past century, and I'm sure that'll happen again, but it has not happened since. So we'll be waiting. But yes, he lived and breathed Shakespeare, and we already kind of talked about this, but his whole life is just living and breathing stage acting and centered around that, and with his unique focus on that and almost nothing else, it's not surprising that became his defining trait, and he became known as the greatest actor. And he's really easy to put up there. If you talk to anybody about the greatest film actors ever, actors, not stars, he's really easy to put up there near the top, because a lot of the rankings you'll see are about the greatest film stars, and you'll see a lot of big personalities. But the greatest film actors, Laurence Olivier is definitely up there, if not the best one in terms of acting ability.
Now, if you're talking about just British stars in general, he probably makes that list, because he was definitely a name among just towering English British figures.
Versus the American studio star machine that generated just a bunch of folks, a bunch of stars, a bunch of very famous people. Ranking stars is ranking famous people, not necessarily ranking talent. To some extent it's ranking charisma, but it's also ranking a lot of other things too that aren't just diehard devotion to a skill. And it might sound like we've ragged on like Laurence Olivier today just because we were talking about him in such a personal manner compared to a lot of other personalities we cover. That's probably just because we talked about the book, or we both read the biography.
Yeah.
And the biography, goes into that, but we're trying to approach it from the angle of like, what about these unique ticks that we got to know Olivier so well through the book? What about those unique ticks, which, clearly make him a complex and flawed individual, make him such a good actor? And I think we kind of connected those dots today.
Yeah. Which is that it was escapism for him. I mean, he wanted to be a really good performer. Like it was his work, and he put all of himself into it. But also, I think there's a lot of natural gifting to it, because it seems like there's a lot of stories from his very early life where he just kind of had this spark. And again, he's not someone who intellectualized his roles too much. He often kind of was force-fed that by directors and stuff like that, especially during the Freudian days. But
very much so, yes.
But he had a very natural sense of character and of humanity that he was able to put into the roles he was given, even if he didn't come at them from the most literary angle.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, Olivier is definitely a famous actor. It's interesting to cover him on the Filmling podcast, though, just because he's
so stage-centric.
Yeah. Film is definitely second. And he's got some amazing film performances there. And I guess all I have to say about that is, that's just his choices, and his focus on stage is what it is. But I'm glad that he did do film performances, and he even got to direct some of his own, because now we have those.
Yeah.
I
think he definitely proved himself as a director too. Like just watching Hamlet, Henry V, Richard III, they're not only good, from an acting perspective, but they're good movies. Like they're technically very, very well made. And even the gimmicky parts of Henry V, I thoroughly enjoyed the Globe Theater bits and stuff like that, and that slow transition. Like he was a good director in his own right.
Oh yeah, certainly. And I'm just glad we have that, because theater's so ephemeral, which isn't a bad thing. But it would be kind of sad to not have a sampling of Olivier's acting for the future generations.
Yeah.
I mean, heck, it would have been sad to have not seen it ourselves.
Right. I mean, it does, though, put you in mind to think of just the long history and tradition of theater and
all the performances we missed.
I mean, but that's part of the medium. It kind of gets passed down. An actor learns from an older great actor, but it also becomes a game of telephone, right? You never are really seeing the greats from before, but you're kind of seeing their influence in the later generations. But yeah, now when we do have film and we have people like Olivier who are able to capture their performances in such a dynamic way, you do kind of get to petrify that and preserve it.
I will say too, filming and archiving of plays has become more popular over the past.
That's what Hamilton
2
did.
decades specifically. Yeah, I was thinking about Hamilton, and I was like, I'm sure other plays do this as well. I probably just don't know where to find them.
Yeah.
But I'm willing to bet that will become more and more popular, especially as.
It's interesting. It's almost going backwards in the way that stage had made its way into film, and then we finally figured out how to make them more than just staged, filmed version of stage, but now we're kind of capturing stage on film. It's like a weird seesaw.
Yes, very much so. But yeah, it would be nice to have. I'm a big proponent of archiving things when possible, even theater performances, just because it's sad to have something like that not available to future generations. But yeah, it is nice to have that and to have Laurence Olivier. Any final thoughts on Laurence Olivier?
I don't think so. He is worth checking out for sure. And interesting to see
the wrapped in a fake nose.
Yeah, interesting to see his influence on the actors of today, especially those who kind of overlap with the tradition, like Branagh and stuff like that.
Oh, certainly. So what are we talking about next time on the podcast, Jonathan?
And now for something completely different. Next time on the podcast, next month, we're talking about a film series, and we're talking about an animated film series, and that is How to Train Your Dragon. And we're going to be talking about all three of the films. How to Train Your Dragon from 2010, How to Train Your Dragon 2 from 2014, and How to Train Your Dragon, The Hidden World from 2019. All very fun, very dragony.
Yeah, it should be a fun one. It should be a very it's a much lighter turn compared to there's some heavy moments in those movies, but this should be a much lighter turn compared to talking about Olivier's story. But we also have stuff going on over on the Patreon bonus podcast with our latest subject, The Frozen North by Buster Keaton.
Yep. Talking about movies from 100 years ago. There are a lot of
exclusively featuring snow
down in the 20s. Yeah, lots of snow.
It's the snow cast. It's the frozen
snow cast over there. It's the Arctic tundra. But if you would like to join us in the Arctic tundra of podcasting, you can check out our Patreon account. Anyone can join us in the Discord and keep up with the conversation throughout the month as we talk about How to Train Your Dragon and whatever else is going on. And if you would like to subscribe on the Patreon, then you also get to listen to us record the podcast live and listen to the bonus podcast about things like the Frozen North from 100 years ago or Eskimos and all that fun stuff. Coming soon. So go check that out on the Patreon.
That's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 422 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us on Twitter at thefilmlings.
Summaries for each of the films this episode were recorded by me, Jason Harden. You can find me on Twitter at thebluejay1994.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. Oh my gosh, I hated that narrator's voice for him. It sounded so whiny.
Yeah, oh yeah, everything he says is really whiny. I don't like that narrator very much.
I know, everything sounds snooty. Although his Michael Caine wasn't bad, but that was the only thing.
That's right, there was a little Michael Caine in there, wasn't there?
Yeah, towards the end. Sleuth. All right, I didn't watch Sleuth.
I do want to be able to track down Sleuth. Sleuth just isn't anywhere. I can't find it.
It looks fun, but yeah, I wanted to see that one.